There are truths buried so deep in the soil of America that even the mountains themselves seem to shiver at their memory. In the hidden hollows of West Virginia lies a story so unsettling that most men will look away and never return to it. Yet, once you hear it, you will not be the same again. This is not a folk tale whispered around a campfire. This is not a rumor passed between curious townsfolk. This is a legacy of blood, a chain of silence, and a prison of flesh carried by generations of one family, the Whittakers of Odd, West Virginia, a family whose very name is spoken in fragments, as if language itself resists what must be said. Picture a weathered wooden house sagging against the weight of time in the shadowed ridges of the Appalachian Mountains. No highways leading in, no schools to reach them. No modern touch to dilute what had begun long ago. Inside lived a lineage trapped by isolation. Cousins marrying cousins, brothers marrying into the same circle again and again. A spiral of blood tightening until escape was no longer possible. The children born of these unions carried more than just the weight of poverty. They carried mutations, distortions, silent cries shaped by genes that mirrored one another too closely to survive without consequence. Filmmakers and reporters who dared to approach this place describe sights so haunting they stay etched into memory forever. Some children unable to speak at all, only able to grunt, bark, or emit strange animal sounds. The human voice lost inside them, their bodies carrying the visible scars of a lineage that folded in on itself for decades without interruption. To the outsider, it feels like a nightmare. Yet to the Whittakers, it was reality, a cycle of circumstance carved into their very blood. But the deeper you look, the more you realize this story is not just about one family in one remote corner of America. It is a mirror reflecting the shadows of Skisse, forgotten history, a history most would rather bury, because to confront it means admitting that beneath the polished surface of civilization, there are pockets where human life is stripped bare of choice, stripped bare of dignity, and stripped bare of voice. And in those pockets, the rules of survival twist into something unrecognizable, something ancient, something forbidden. To understand the Whittakers, you must first understand the land that shaped them, because West Virginia is not just a backdrop. It is a character of its own, a place that molds men into shadows and families into secrets. The Appalachian Mountains rise like ancient guardians, their slopes thick with forests, their valleys cut deep and narrow roads twisting like veins through a body, long forgotten by progress. Here isolation is not an accident, it is destiny. Generations ago, when settlers first carved out homes in these rugged hills, the rest of America was racing toward expansion, industry, and connection. But in these hollows, time slowed to a crawl. Whole families living miles from their nearest neighbor, tied to the soil, tied to the coal mines, tied to one another. When poverty struck, when opportunity died, when the government looked away, there was nowhere to turn except inward. And that is where the Whittakers began their descent. The family lived in the town of Odd, a name that itself feels like prophecy. Odd was not a place where fortune arrived. It was a place where fortune evaporated, leaving only survival behind. Brothers married cousins, cousins married within the same circle, the bloodline folding tighter and tighter with each generation, until what was once family became something else entirely, something darker, something heavier. This was not done out of malice, this was done out of circumstance, because the mountains built walls that no one dared cross, and within those walls the rules of humanity bent and broke. Reporters who dared step into Odd decades later described the silence of the Whittaker home as unbearable, a silence broken only by grunts, by barks, by unintelligible sounds that should have been words but were not, children with vacant stares, adults with twisted expressions. A family caught between human and something unspoken. The world outside labeled them freaks, monsters, abominatio. Nay, yet inside those broken walls they were simply surviving, the only way they knew how. But here is the chilling truth. My friend, what happened to the Whittakers is not only about them, it is about what happens when society abandons its forgotten corners, when the powerful ignore the powerless, when the outside world closes its doors and a family is left to turn only to itself. You do not get progress, you get decay. You do not get growth, you get collapse. When outsiders finally discovered the Whittakers, it was not through government aid or neighbors offering help. It was through the curious lens of journalists and documentarians, men who heard whispers of a family so cut off from the world that their very existence felt like an urban legend. The most famous of these encounters came when Mark Leta, a filmmaker and photographer, ventured into the heart of Odd, armed with nothing but his camera and a willingness to confront the unthinkable. What he found was not a family prepared to speak for themselves, but a family communicating in fragments. Some members could form words, though twisted and broken, while others expressed themselves only in guttural sounds. A bark here, a grunt there, a language that bypassed the mind and came from some primal place beneath speech itself. Their eyes told stories, those stories few could bear to face. Blank stares that seemed to gaze past reality and into some void carved out by generations of isolation. The house was falling apart, the yard, cluttered with scraps and debris. Yet within those walls lay a lineage, still breathing, still surviving, even as the outside world judged them as less than human. Lita described moments of fear, not fear of violence, but fear of the unknown, fear of being confronted with a reflection of humanity that civilization prefers to deny, because standing in front of the Whittakers was like standing in front of a question no one dares ask. What does it mean to be human when your voice is taken, when your choices are stripped, when your bloodline itself becomes a prison? He filmed them, he photographed them, and the images spread across the internet, faster than wildfire. Millions of viewers stared in shock, disgust, fascination, horror. The Whittakers had lived hidden for generations. Yet suddenly their faces, their sounds, their lives became a spectacle for the world to consume. Some viewers mocked them, some pitied them, some condemned the filmmaker for exploitation, while others argued that exposing their reality was the only way to reveal the forgotten corners of America that everyone else had abandoned. But beneath the noise of online debates, one truth remained undeniable. The Whittakers were no longer shadows in the Appalachian Mountains. They were forced into the light of a digital age, an age where secrets cannot remain secrets forever, and once that light touches darkness, it changes everything forever. The sudden exposure of the Whittakers to the outside world did not come without a cost, because when cameras leave, the conversation remains. When images fade from headlines, the echo of judgment continues to haunt those who were filmed. For the Whittakers, this meant that the fragile privacy they once held even in poverty and silence was shattered forever. Neighbors in surrounding towns whispered louder, some shaking their heads in pity, others muttering in disgust, and a few seeing opportunity for their own voices to rise by attaching themselves to the story. Odd West Virginia was no longer invisible. Now it was marked on the map by curiosity seekers, strangers driving in hoping to glimpse the family that had been labeled as America's most inbred, as if human suffering were a tourist attraction. But what the world failed to see was the deeper wound beneath the spectacle. Generations of the Whittakers had been shaped by forces far larger than themselves, forces of geography, poverty, abandonment, and silence. The mountains that locked them in were not of their making, the lack of education, the absence of opportunity. the failure of the state to protect and uplift its poorest citizens. These were the invisible chains binding them long before bloodlines folded inward, and yet the blame always fell on the family, as though they had chosen this life, as though survival itself were a crime. It is easier for society to point a finger than to look into a mirror, easier to call them monsters than to admit we allowed monsters of neglect and abandonment to grow in our own backyard. Because if the Whittakers are a horror story, then it is not only theirs, it is ours too. Think about it, my friend. What does it say about a nation that builds skyscrapers of glass and steel while allowing entire families to decay in silence within its forgotten valleys? What does it mean when millions can scroll past images of broken and lives with fascination but without action? Are we witnesses or are we accomplices? The Whittakers may be unique in their extremity, but they are not alone in their essence. Across the world, in places both rural and urban, families are trapped by cycles of poverty and silence, cycles that deform not only the body but the soul. And unless the powerful intervene, unless the forgotten are remembered, the story of the Whittakers will not remain an isolated horror. It will remain a prophecy. As the world debated over the images of the Whittakers, a darker truth began to rise from the shadows, the truth of what happens to a mind and a soul when trapped in cycles that span generations. Because this is not only a story of broken bloodlines, it is a story of psychological prisons, prisons without walls, without bars, but no less suffocating. Imagine being born into a world where the boundaries of your existence are fixed before you take your first breath. No school to teach you words, no roads to take you beyond the valley, no doctors to guide your health, no choices outside the narrow circle of survival. In such a place, the mind folds inward, just as the blood does thought itself, becomes trapped within the same loops, generation after generation, until the ability to imagine escape is lost. The Whittakers were not just cut off from society, they were cut off from the very concept of what society could offer. For some family members, this meant silence. They could not form words because no one had ever shown them how to shape language. For others, it meant fear of outsiders, a suspicion carved deep by decades of ridicule, rejection, and judgment. And for all of them, it meant living in a world where shame was inherited like the color of one's eyes, a mark that could never be washed away. Psychologists who study extreme isolation have long warned that the human mind is a mirror of its environment. Starve it of stimulation, and it shrinks. Surround it with silence, and it forgets how to speak. Expose it only to itself, and it begins to turn inward into shadows. The Whittakers became the living embodiment of this warning, a family whose suffering was not born from cruelty, but from abandonment. Yet, the most haunting question remains: what responsibility do we bear when such suffering is revealed? Do we merely watch, analyze, debate as though it were a case study, or do we face the uncomfortable reality? What happened in Odd, West Virginia is not only about genes, but about a society that allowed silence to fester until silence itself became hereditary. Because silence is the cruelest inheritance of all, and in the story of the Whittakers, silence was not only their burden, it was their destiny. Every dark story carries with it a lesson, and the Whittakers are no exception, because beneath the shock and the whispers lies a mirror held up to the entire human condition, a mirror that shows what happens when the chain of compassion breaks. The tragedy of Odd, West Virginia is not only that a family became trapped in their own bloodline, it is that the outside world watched generation after generation and did nothing. Ask yourself, how many decades did it take before a stranger with a camera finally entered their home? How many officials passed through Raleigh County without asking what was hidden in its hollows? How many neighbors knew yet chose silence, because silence is easier than confrontation? It is here where the story turns from tragedy into indictment. Not of the Whittakers, but of us all, for what is a society if not the sum of its care for the most vulnerable, when the forgotten are left to decay, when children are born into cages of ignorance and despair, when families are branded as freaks instead of rescued. What does that say about the civilization we build with such pride? We may build highways across the mountains. But if those highways do not lead to salvation for the lost, then they are monuments of neglect, not progress. The Whittakers were exposed to the world not through mercy but through curiosity. Millions watched their suffering through glowing screens, as if it were entertainment. But few asked what could be done to heal, what could be built to restore, what could be offered to break the cycle. The spectacle consumed them, but the solutions avoided them, and so the curse continued. But here is the truth. My friend, curses do not fall from the sky. They are forged by human hands, and they can be broken by human will. The Whittakers did not choose their chains, but we as a people can choose whether those chains remain. We can choose to look away, or we can choose to confront shadows we have allowed to grow in our own land, because the fate of the Whittakers is not sealed in stone. It is sealed only if we refuse to change. And that refusal would mean that the true curse is not theirs, it is ours. And now we arrive at the final truth. The reason why the story of the Whittakers refuses to leave our minds, why it lingers like a shadow long after the camera turns away. It is because their story is not just theirs, it is ours too. It forces us to confront the boundaries of empathy, the weight of judgment, and the cost of silence. In every haunting grunt, every broken word, every blank stare lies a question that none of us want to answer. What happens when we allow human beings to vanish in plain sight? The Whittakers remind us that history is not only written in books, it is carved into faces forgotten by progress left behind by the march of time. Their suffering is not an isolated curse. In the mountains, it is a symbol of what happens when society builds walls higher than bridges, when comfort for the many is valued over mercy for the few. Some call them monsters, others call them victims. But perhaps the truth is that they are both and neither at once. They are human beings stripped of choice, shaped by forces beyond their control, and thrust into the harsh gaze of a world that finds their tragedy both fascinating and repulsive. And what does that reveal about us, that we consume their pain as content, that we analyze their misery as curiosity, while failing to address the deeper sickness that allowed it to exist? You see, the Whittakers are not a horror movie. They are a mirror that reflects the fragility of the human spirit, the vulnerability of the forgotten, and the consequences of generations of neglect. Their story warns us that darkness does not come only from cruelty, it comes from abandonment, from the silence that festers when no one dares to speak, when no one dares to act. So if there is any lesson in this cursed bloodline, it is that humanity must not look away again, because every time we ignore the suffering of the unseen, we invite that same darkness into our own homes. The Whittakers stand as a warning carved into the heart of America, that even in the land of freedom, entire families can still be bound by invisible chains. And unless we break those chains, unless we learn to confront the shadows, the story of the Whittakers will not be the last. It will only be the beginning.